Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Gaming, and we return yet again to media intersections with Curseborne. This time, the X-Files. Now, the X-Files was a massive TV show for me when I was a teenager. I was, of course, a teenager in the 1990s when the X-Files was new. We didn't have satellite television at my house, but there was a colleague of my dad's who would record it and let us borrow the videos. So every single week, we would watch another episode of The X-Files, and this went on for years and years and years because there are a lot of seasons of The X-Files. And I think it's impossible to really escape the influence that The X-Files had on the public consciousness. It was successful in a way that TV shows like Kolchak, although that was popular too, but wasn't exactly the phenomenon that The X-Files was. Indeed, other TV shows of this kind, The Outer Limits, Millennium, Lone Gunman, of course, some of these connected to The X-Files weren't as popular. The X-Files had a massive cultural imprint on the way we see conspiracy theories, alien abduction stories, and of course I wouldn't say they invented the Monster of the Week idea, but they certainly propagated it. The idea that every single episode interspersed with the conspiracy episodes was going to be a new kind of supernatural threat. And yes, you could argue that by about season 4 or 5, it was really straining credulity for Scully to not be a believer as well, given everything she had encountered, or for Mulder to have obtained sufficient evidence to present it to the world entire. But he was at heart an FBI agent, so he maintained his silence. For some reason. Well, I'm guessing because the syndicate wouldn't allow him to speak up about it. And I'm aware that a lot of people who have backed Curseborne have spoken about how this creature from the X-Files would work really well in Curseborne, or how that plot from the X-Files would work really well in Curseborne, and I completely agree. As I say, the X-Files was truly a very important show to me, and I haven't rewatched it all that much, probably because of its length. I've dipped in and looked up specific episodes that I've wanted to revisit, and I should really go to some of the ones that I've, I guess, kind of forgotten about. But I do have a pretty decent memory, I would say, of the X-Files and the episodes that really stood out to me, to the extent that I know some of them were direct influences on not only my work on Curseborne, but the way I run Curseborne. And this extends to other horror role-playing games too, mind you. There are some villains, some plot lines in the X-Files that you can't just leave in Curseborne. They are, of course, perfectly suitable for Conspiracy X, perfectly suitable for Delta Green. There are lots of games for which these kinds of plots work. But what I wanted to do, because I wanted to gauge people's interest here, I wanted to know how involved with the X-Files are all of you? Are you a generation too late for it? Did you watch The X-Files when it was new? Have you sought it out since on whatever streaming platform you can find it? I think it's on Paramount Plus, but you can probably find it elsewhere, depending on where you are in the world. If not, I recommend you check some of these episodes out. And in fact, I have compiled something of a list, and that will turn out to be an appropriate name, appropriate term to use here, of the first 3 seasons. There is going to be, I'm going to name a couple of episodes in each season that you can almost directly port into your game of Curseborne, and I will explain how. And if this video is popular, if people really engage with the subject matter, we will do another X-Files themed video where we do seasons 4, 5, and 6, and then maybe even 7, 8, and 9. We start entering some ropey territory, but there are still some hits in those latter seasons, even though the established format falls away. I would argue it had to fall away, otherwise it would become repetitive. So, let's have a look first of all, at Season 1. Obviously, Season 1 is where the X-Files starts, the clue is in the name, and therefore they are finding their feet very much. There are far more Monster of the Week episodes than there are conspiracy episodes in Season 1, for example. It's only by Season 3, I would suggest, that really the conspiracy gets into real full gear. I guess Dwayne Barry in Season 2 is where it really kicks off for both of our characters. But let's look at Season 1 first of all. Now, I think I would be remiss in not mentioning the, well, I guess, dual episode, one at the beginning of Season 1, one at the end of Season 1, in the form of Squeeze and Toombs. Now, a lot of people have mentioned Toombs, Eugene Victor Toombs, as a potential Curseborne villain, an adversary that you can face, someone that doesn't quite conform to any of the accursed lineages, but is most definitely a creature of damnation. And this liver-eating, hungry type, if you like, who has managed to manufacture an immortality for himself by hunting down and sating himself on the livers of his victims, is a really eerie, creepy kind of killer. Of course, most well known, I would suggest, not for the liver eating, but for his ability to contort and stretch his body in inhuman ways. There's the famous scene from the X-Files where he is trying to climb through the ventilation shaft and his arm and fingers just keep getting longer and longer and stretching closer and closer to the camera. I can imagine the idea in a game of Curseborne that your characters have managed to trap a blight on your local community that has seemed like a pretty mundane blight. Maybe he has some hedge magic, maybe he knows some things, this killer, but doesn't give away that there is anything more to him than that. And so they lock him away in a secure room. And then, while their backs are turned, he escapes by essentially melting his bones and sloughing through a vent or something like that. That's a nice way of cranking up the creepiness. The other Season 1 episode I would like to talk about is Lazarus. Now, Lazarus is an episode where it starts with a bank robbery, and you are introduced to a secondary FBI agent, not Mulder or Scully, Willis. And Willis is obsessed with this particular bank robbing duo. Now, during the bank robbery, something terrible happens. There's a shootout. Willis falls. The primary bank robber, Dupree, falls. And both of them die. However, Willis is brought back to life. After which his behaviour starts changing, and he starts behaving not just in erratic, but also violent and, let's call it, homicidal ways, because it transpires that Dupree's spirit has moved into Willis and started to possess him. This is archetypal dead behaviour in Curseborne. I think this is a really good way of introducing a character. Your character, indeed, could be a bank robber who died, and then you went on to possess someone else who was shot in the same shootout. So maybe you took out a cop at the same time as they took you out, and you decided, right, now's the time to leave this body behind. I'm going to get this one up and pretend that the body isn't dead, but in fact it actually is, and has been ever since I blew it away with a shotgun. Lazarus isn't ever really rated as one of the highest graded X-Files episodes, but I think for a Curseborne origin story for a character, Lazarus is a really strong beat to use. Now, moving into Season 2, and I know there are so many episodes that we could really look at. I think there's even some benefit to looking at some of the, again, lesser reviewed episodes like Roland from the first season, Fire from the first season. All of them have their place, and I love them all, the ones I remember, but we have to get on to Season 2. Season 2 is when the X-Files, as I say, really starts kicking into gear. It finds its feet, it knows what it's doing, it introduces you to a character whose codename is X, and the conspiracy starts unveiling itself. You'll note that in this video we are not talking about the conspiracy episodes. That isn't the point. The conspiracies can exist in Curseborne. Indeed, that is a strong element of higher tiers of play of Curseborne, which we will get into in later Curseborne books. But we'll stick to monsters and threats right now, and the ones in Season 2 I particularly enjoy, especially Aunt D Velets. I'm probably screwed that pronunciation up. Or Die Hand Die Velets, if you really wanted to get English, I guess, English language about it. It is a story about a coven, a witch, a Satan coven, where in a small town community there is all manner of sacrifice taking place. It's got a Wicker Man kind of feel to it, except it's very much focused on the Satan side of ritual behavior. There is a scene where an anaconda, probably our lead Satanist in anaconda form, eats someone whole. There is one of the scariest episodes of The X-Files, as I remember. If I recall, it was the only one rated 18, I want to say, in the UK anyway. At least at that early stage. And the visuals in Diant de Velets or Welets are just some of the strongest in all of the X-Files. I remember when I watched it the first time, I thought, this is a scary episode. I was scared by it. How to use it in Curseborne? Well, this is another one of those excellent examples where you can have mortals who have stumbled upon some of the magic of the accursed, who have stumbled on the ability to wield, bind curses, and use it to empower themselves. Maybe even with some kind of outsider patron. Not necessarily an outcast, though it could be. It could be a Nephilim, or it could be a Chimera. But I'm more thinking a creature more malevolent and alien from the outside that is giving them patronage, and has currently taken the form of a human cultist, and is quite prepared to sacrifice the rest of the cult to preserve its life, as happens in that episode. This episode of Season 2 of The X-Files is one I recommend anyone checks out if they want a good horror story. And the other one from Season 2 I want to talk about is Soft Light. Now, Soft Light is more sci-fi than horror. The character Chester Banton is played as a scientist who has delved far too deep into some forbidden science. He is effectively a walking black hole, and anyone that his shadow touches, or who his shadow touches, is basically obliterated, disintegrated. And so he has to exist in soft light. If he goes anywhere where the light is harder, his shadow will get too strong and it will destroy everyone around him. It will snuff out all electrics, it will kill all life that it touches. The reason I pick on Soft Light is because this is a really good example of a Curseborne plot you can do that is completely off the wall for most Curseborne stories. If Diant de Velets is an episode or a plot for Curseborne where your antagonists are kind of grounded, they are normal humans who have delved too deep into the occult. Our normal human who has delved too deep into science and made himself a wandering blight on the world is something you could really play up the tragedy of in Curseborne. Become aware of this character and try to help him or try to stop him, even though he has no desire to be doing these things. But when cornered, if he thinks he's going to be put in a laboratory somewhere, if he thinks he's going to be experimented on, he will allow his shadow to cast over people and destroy them. I think that's a nice way of twisting it around, but the tragedy element I think is very important. Season 3, for the longest time, was my favourite season of The X-Files, without doubt. I think it's got some of the strongest episodes in general, and one I wanted to pick on was Pusher. Pusher may have been one of the first episodes of The X-Files I saw on TV instead of on video. I remember watching it and being really struck by it, and so it stuck with me. The idea of simply a character that can impose a command, a psychic command, via his words that you are then compelled to do, no matter how self-destructive it is. This, much like Soft Light, is a really good example of a character. So now we have a coven, a cultist, Satanist cult that is doing this for power, and a wicked patron. We have a scientist who delved too deep. I think in the way of Pusher, you have a a hungry parasite that is going around getting into the minds of people, or probably a sorcerer. I think a sorcerer is probably a stronger way of going about it. A sorcerer with access to dire command. who can get into the heads of his victims. And what's more, and I always enjoy these kinds of antagonists to spice up a game of Curseborne or any other horror game, this isn't a character who has some grand scheme. This is not a character who wants to rule the world, take down his enemies, rule a corporation, or anything like that. This is a character who will quite happily sit in the background, will live a life, will have a family, a bunch of kids, and a good old job. But then when someone crosses him, he whispers in that person's ear, "When you next see the colour blue, you're going to blow your brains out." Or worse to that effect. And there might be some time, there might be some minutes, there might be some hours that pass before they next perceive the colour blue, but at that point, for some reason, that person kills themselves, almost untraceable to the pusher in question. I think having a sorcerer who has that ability and eschews the idea of joining a cursed crew or adhering to their family's whims is a nice way of demonstrating a rogue element. Now, the last one of Season 3 I want to spotlight is The List. I said using that term would be appropriate. And again, The List isn't usually one of the favourites people choose from the X-Files, let alone Season 3, which has so many strong ones. I know DPO was one I was thinking of, but I think The List works so damn well because it speaks to the heart of a curse. Someone is being executed. They're in the electric chair, and in their final words, they promise that they will reincarnate, and the 5 people that put them in this position will die horribly. And wouldn't you know it, after this person is executed, the people on his list start dying horribly. There's an element of Final Destination to it. There's an element of there being a serial killer to it. You can look at the dead aspect of it. Is this a naturally occurring curse? Is this a curse being carried out by one of this executed person's friends to make sure it is done? Maybe there'll be a backlash if it isn't done. This is maybe the strongest episode, I would say, out of all the ones I've listed for direct Curseborne translation. The idea that this death note of characters' names, they will all die unless there is some way to undo or mitigate the curse. Now, how do you do that when the person who set it up has been executed? Have they left a phantasm you can negotiate with? Is there a way to eradicate the curse by making a deal with a higher entity? These are all the kinds of things I like to consider, and these are just some of the ways the X-Files can intersect with your games of Curseborne. Now, as I say, if this video appeals to you, if you are a fan of the X-Files, I would love to hear your thoughts on episodes from Season 1, 2, and 3 in the comments below. What you would use to influence your games of Curseborne. And if you want to see more of these videos, please comment below to let me know. I know some people love these media inspiration videos, some people just pass them by. If you've watched them, it is really important to me that you comment, not because I need the attention, but because it tells me what you like. So please consider leaving a comment, and if you haven't backed Curseborne already, you've only got a couple of days left to do so, so you better get on that. The video link is in the description above, or below me right now, and I hope to see you over there in the comments of the Kickstarter. Thank you very much for watching.